And you would think something like a burger is exactly what any group of Americans could bond over, right? Mm-hmm. And it turns out, no.
Do you get aroused by stimulating intellectual conversation? Are you turned on by the idea of engaging with thought leaders from across the United States? Do you go gaga over exploring important ideas from influential books, research, and essays? Then welcome to Curiosity Porn, the place you can satisfy all those intellectual urges guilt-free. Your hosts are Dr. Guy Crane, Professor of Philosophy at Rose State College, and Professor James Davenport, Professor of Political Science at Rose State College. However, the views expressed here are solely the views of the hosts and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. And now, here are James and Guy. And good afternoon to you, Dr. Guy Crane.
Hello, sir.
How's it going?
I am not a fan of the heat. I just want to state that up front.
Getting a little toasty, and my understanding is next week it is going to be horrendous.
I asked my wife to look at the weather. I just said, have you seen the forecast for next week? And she opened it up and almost immediately just cried. I think there might be a lot of maybe happy hour frozen drinks in our future next week just to try to survive that. It's
hard. There was about a decade ago, we had a summer where you had like 60 straight days of 100-degree temperatures. I'm hoping we're not going to hit one of those things again.
I do recall, actually do remember that, yes.
Yeah. And then you found out some of your materials were online for people to see, yes?
Yeah, that wasn't my best moment today. I started to try to build my fall schedule a little bit. Right. Honestly, I had other plans. I was going to start writing a brand new paper today. Okay. And have you ever you realize like you have so much brain fog that there's
it's just not going to happen. Mm-hmm.
You're going to be in the zone and have that kind of focus. So I decided like, what is something way more mindless I can actually do productively? And so I'm thinking like, I'll just set up the online stuff for the fall. And I just decided randomly, because this has happened to me before, to copy and paste the questions into Google, and you put quotes around them because you're looking for your exact stuff. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I found multiple of my quizzes online, but I've already sent the emails to those admins, and they're pretty good about taking them down. Actually,
I probably need to check and see if any of mine stuffs. I've never done that, so
it's entirely possible you can.
That's wild. That's wild. Students these days.
Today is another, non-standard day for our podcast.
Yeah.
We're here to talk about, your article. I was about to say you, which I have heard a rumor that is your favorite topic to discuss.
I could talk about myself. Yeah.
Well, but you got this article, and it's only fair that since it's your paper, that we at least go through the get to know you questions for you. We've done it for me.
Okay, we did do it for you. That's right. Okay. That's right.
How did you get into academia?
We like a previous guest said, who I don't think that episode has come out yet, but I stumbled into academia, or maybe fell backwards into it is the better description. That's what I tell people. It was not my first career choice, right? So I came out of college with a degree in political science. I thought, okay, I'm going to be in politics, right? And at the time I was working for a member of Congress here in Oklahoma, and worked on their staff for about 5.5, 6 years. And thought that was going to be my trajectory. I was going to do that and maybe do some other stuff. I went into campaign consulting. Eventually, I even ran for office. That's a story for another day. But that's what I thought. I was going to have some kind of career in politics. That didn't play out. I was shifting around, trying to figure out for about 2 or 3 years, what is it I really wanted to be? I worked for a nonprofit. That wasn't it. I worked for a polling firm. That really wasn't it. Took a couple of just really odd jobs and couldn't find my my niche. I had taught as an adjunct for a number of years, and then quit. I kind of got burnt out and was going through this kind of job change position, quit. And I was like, I don't know what I really want to do, but I need to do something to feed the family.
How did you get into the first adjuncting gig?
So when I got my master's degree, my thesis chair said, you should think about teaching. Two things he said. He said, you need to go get your PhD and you should think about teaching. And I said, I'm tired. I have a family. The PhD thing's going to have to wait. But he said, but you could adjunct. And so I did that for a number of years. So primarily at UCO and OCCC. Then fast forward to this new period. I'm like, I know what I can do, and I'm decent in the classroom. And so started picking up some adjunct gigs again. And then in 2014, Rose State offered me a part-time, not a part-time, but a
fixed term, right?
Yes, a 1-year temporary appointment. And I knew I enjoyed the classroom. And so I just decided I was going to take that year. And they said, after that year, we're going to open this position up. And if you want it, you'll have to apply for it and go through all the interviews and such and whatnot. And I said, okay, I'll do that. And I decided that over the course of that year, I was just going to embed myself so deep in the campus that if at the end of that process, they decided they want to get rid of me, it'd be like pulling a molar without anesthesia, right? And so it worked, and they haven't got rid of me since.
I remember you were busy that year. We did a lot of panels that year.
Yeah.
A lot of guest lecture stuff. I remember that. Well, okay, something you're currently reading, listening to, or watching that is interesting.
Okay, so you've seen my office. I've got a couple of bookshelves, right? I've got a couple of bookcases. One shelf on my bookcase is dedicated to all the books that I haven't read yet.
You have an entire shelf there.
I have an entire shelf.
Okay.
And
I feel
the
a lot
problem
better
with
now.
that shelf is there never gets any fewer books on that shelf, right? So here's, and I'm usually reading more than one book at a time. And so here's the books that I'm reading right now. The 7 Deadly Economic Sins by James Addison, The China Dilemma by Ryan York and Ethan Yang, Change Your World by John Maxwell, and Rationality by Steven Pinker. So that is...
I thought you'd already read that one. I guess
no.
It's
been on the shelf, but I haven't actually finished it.
It's I'm thinking of the Enlightenment.
You're thinking
book.
Enlightenment Now, So that
this one
Better
came out
Angels,
after Enlightenment, right?
I think it's the most recent book he's written.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a little bit tougher slug for me than, say, his other 2 books that I've read.
I heard him interview about it on a podcast, and that was just not super sexy to listen to.
No, I mean, but it'll be a good read. I'm sure I'll enjoy being able to say I finished it, but it's one of those books that you're making your way through it, and then another book comes along that's a little bit more entertaining. I don't know if that's the right word. It's a little bit easier to read.
Yeah.
And so you get distracted.
This one is eating your vegetables kind of book, I'm guessing.
Kind of a thing, right? I listen, like you do, to a ton of different podcasts. So these are just a smattering of some of the podcasts that I listen to that I really like. Not Another Politics podcast, and we had one of the co-hosts, Anthony Fowler, on that. I really enjoy that one. Econ Talk, Left, Right, and Center is another politically kind of focused one, which is really good. And then almost anything out of the Freakonomics network of podcasts.
Very well produced.
They are amazing.
They sparkle. They must have a team and a lot of cash behind them.
Yes. Well, when you write a New York Times bestselling book,
that doesn't
and
hurt.
then spin a podcast out of it, that seems to work better than other ways of starting a podcast.
Yeah, why don't we just do that?
I don't know what we were thinking.
Take care of the bestseller part, and I will spin it into a podcast. Let's just do that by next Tuesday.
There you go. Sure. Okay. I can make that happen.
You're a political scientist.
Yes.
So this is why we're phrasing the question this way. Who is the greatest political scientist of all time?
James Madison. That's my story, and I'm
swear to
sticking to
God,
it.
I thought you were going to say James Davenport.
I am not that egotistical. I want our listeners to know my head may swell from time to time, but I'm not that egotistical.
You spit it out so fast that I thought for sure you had that locked and loaded. Well, give us a slight rundown here. Why
Okay, so Madison, if you've read the Constitution, So going into the Constitutional Convention, Madison had basically been working for a year on a plan for government. And he convinces the Virginia delegation, and specifically, I believe it was Edmund Randolph, to introduce this plan, right? And it becomes known as the Virginia Plan. And while it's not just wholesale adopted by the convention, there are lots of changes and whatnot. It's kind of the foundation on which the Constitution is eventually constructed. And if you read the Federalist Papers and you get a sense for how Madison is explaining this and why we need to set things up in certain ways and how you can't just assume that always you're going to have good people in government making the proper decisions. And so you need to construct it in a way that can control for that. And his suggestions for how to do that, how to overcome some of the downsides of democracy, I think are all pretty enlightened stuff. And so I'm a fan of Madison's construction of that type of understanding about government. And I'm not sure if I wasn't going to pick Madison, I'm not sure who else I would pick. So I'm sticking with Madison.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about your one article today, but you got more articles out there than that. You got several popular pieces. So tell me one thing about your work you wish people understood better.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So I'm going to stick with the kind of the political science theme here. And that is that politics and political science are not the same thing. And we have to kind of help our political science majors understand this early on, right? Politics, the in and out, the partisan nature, the arguing back and forth, the struggle for power, that's something that political scientists study. But to be a political scientist is to bring the tools of social science to bear on how does government work and how do all these pieces fit, and trying to step out of the partisanship and the rancor that might be going on at any particular time, and to say what seems to work well and what doesn't. So I think that for me is probably the biggest thing that I think not just the general public, but even our political science students don't maybe understand early on, and you have to kind of help them see that.
All right. I get to say this last get to know you question with a smirk on my face because I see what happens to you on Facebook quite frequently. But the question is, what is a belief that you hold that puts you at odds with your peers, colleagues, or family?
You're going to let me share one, huh? Okay. Well, I'll do the most recent one that seems to. So for those of you who aren't aware, a week or so ago, maybe a little bit more, former President Donald Trump was convicted of 34 counts of something in New York, right? Or
so the libs would have us believe.
That's right. And so here's my take on that. I firmly believe Donald Trump pretty much did everything he was accused of doing in that trial, right? Absolutely believe he did that, okay? And like other actions he's taken, I think that action should disqualify him, at least in the minds of voters, for the office of president. Okay, there's one. But
there are people that disagree with that?
Yeah, there are, right? I'm also not convinced that what he did was actually illegal. And I'm pretty well convinced that his convictions are going to be overturned on appeal. So I don't make anybody happy.
Right? Oh, yeah, okay.
Because the Trump supporters are just rabid that I'm agreeing that he did all this bad stuff and that should disqualify him as candidate for president. But then the progressive anti-Trump folks don't like the fact that I'm like, but it's not necessarily illegal.
Yeah.
Right. And that goes to my thinking of, you don't have to have done something illegal from my perspective to disqualify you, at least from my perspective, from running for office, right? If what you do is so morally egregious or so certainly inappropriate, even if it's not illegal, I don't want you being president.
One would think that is sensible, I guess. But I think that is about as good a transition as, because you said what you said, it's a shocker that any take on Trump would ever put people at odds with
right
each other.
with each other, right?
Most controversial thing I've heard, but that is exactly why this is a good segue to what we're going to talk about. You have this article. It is for the news site NonDoc. Okay, you titled it,
which, by the way, is a fantastic news site. I'm just going to stick out a plug there for NonDoc. They do great work.
I will say I haven't read a lot of NonDoc stuff, maybe one other before this, but what I deeply appreciated was just the aesthetic. There's not just like ads in the way of the text, and it's really pretty a smooth read the way that they've got it set up. Okay, your article is called "We Hate Each Other: Growing Incivility Undermines the Values of Our Democracy." Now, okay, I wrote an article and you interviewed me for this, but I thought instead of just straightforwardly interviewing you about it, I really wanted to take a deep dive because you cite some just fantastic social science material throughout the entire article that just, it was almost like Wikipedia rabbit trail, like every link, and I had to go look up the next paper. Okay, so before we do that though, just how did this article come about? Was it spontaneous? Was it requested? Where did the idea come from?
I had been following a lot of research and commentary on the divisions among Americans that seem to have been growing over the last few decades, right? And these divisions have important impacts on our political institutions, but also on many of the institutions of civil society, that our political institutions are actually founded upon, or that they need to sustain democratic governance. And so I thought it was important to publicly communicate what social scientists have found about this polarization, why we should be concerned about it, and what we might be able to do to minimize it. So I reached out to NonDoc. I've written some stuff for them before. Said, hey, I've got this idea for this article. What would you think? And they were like, write it up and let's see what we can do with it. And so there you go. I wrote it, they published it, and we were off to the races.
All right. Okay. Well, let's start by talking about the problem is. You're identifying a problem here. We're talking about incivility. You mentioned misperception, disdain, hatred. And to be clear, we're not just talking about incivility in any context at all, but in our public and political discourse, right?
Right. And at least initially, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, but initially that's what political scientists were concerned with, right? Is that how is this impacting the way in which we try to resolve political questions? And what is there damage? Is it becoming harder to resolve these political disputes as a result of this? I think, however, political scientists and quite frankly, other social scientists have recognized is that this dislike of others appears to be bleeding into other areas of life. And this is an unfortunate result, as we will explore later, of the borderline for what counts as political discourse being expanded to include virtually the whole of one's life, right? And the choices that you make. And so I think that is what we're talking about at this point.
Okay. All right. Well, here's a quote from your article. You write, at virtually all levels of our country's democracy, partisans, the most loyal Democrats and Republicans, increasingly loathe one another. Okay, you unpack that in a couple of ways. I kind of want to go out of order compared to what you did the article. I'd like to actually start about the stuff you cite about the perception gap between Republicans and Democrats. What is meant by the term perception gap? And can you talk about the study material you cite about this?
Sure. So this was a study done by the group called More in Common and the polling firm of YouGov, who does a lot of polling related to political issues and politics and such. And you can find this actual study at perceptiongap.us. I'm sure we'll link to that in the show notes as well. But here's the bottom line coming out of that study. They say that, quote, overall, Democrats and Republicans imagine almost twice as many of their political opponents as reality hold views they consider extreme, right? Even on the most controversial issues in our national debates, Americans are less divided than most of us think. And so this is the odd thing about the type of polarization that we're dealing with here, is that it doesn't necessarily seem to be focused on real large divisions on the issues. So you look at issues like gun control or abortion or some of these really hot button issues, and survey after survey says there's a sizable middle that has some general agreement on those issues. And so where is this dislike for each other coming? And we'll get into that a little bit later, but it's not just based on you think this about taxes and I think the opposite or something like that, right? And Democrats and Republicans were asked to estimate what percentage of the other party agrees or disagrees with statements about things like immigration and racism and gun control and such. And then it was compared to the actual percentage of those in those parties who agreed or disagreed with the statements. And these statements, by the way, were meant to tease out some of the more stereotypical extreme views of either side. So such as most police officers are bad people, or the U.S. should have completely open borders, right? So they were giving them almost this caricature of what people might think the other side thinks and saying, what percentage of those folks actually agree with this?
Okay, so what did they find out about the difference?
And that the gap is real, and there are some things that can contribute to it. But let's start with this, right? Democrats and Republicans tend to overestimate the extremity of each other's views, and they think a far greater share of the other party agrees with those more extreme statements than really do, right? Republicans have an average perception gap of about 27%, and Democrats have an average perception gap of about 19%.
So let me just make clear what those numbers mean. So in other words, like if I'm the average Republican, say, and I'm guessing the percentage about how many Democrats do you think agree with this, if I'm just giving the average, I'm going to be on average wrong 27%.
Right.
Like in other words, 27% fewer Democrats actually agree with it than I would have guessed.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, all right. I really like this because I didn't have a name for it. I want to share you some more evidence for that gap that I use in one of my classes. When I'm in my logic class, I like to talk about stereotypes quite a bit. And I like to show this chart. I got it from an article in 538 by Perry Bacon Jr. It's a 2018 article. And the title is Democrats Are Wrong About Republicans and Republicans Are Wrong About Democrats. Okay, well, this isn't his original work. He's reporting on some survey work done by a couple of political scientists. And I love to show this article because it was basically almost that exercise. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't like issue positions. It was like social category kind of things, right? And so they asked Republicans, give a percentage. How many Democrats do you think are atheist or agnostic or black or LGBTQ or union members? And so they were doing that exact thing. What was the guesses compared to like the actual rates? And some of these I just think are almost comical, the gap that exists here. So how many Democrats are agnostic or atheist? So Republicans estimated that be over a third of Democrats. Right. So over like a 36%. Mm-hmm. When you look at the actual share, it's less than 10%. The reason I think some of these are funny is if you just think about like the base rate period, not like Democrats or Republicans, just how many atheists are there in America? You would be there's no way it's 36%. That is a crazy amount of people, right? My favorite one, though, is how many are LGBTQ? Uh-huh. And Republicans estimated that 38% of Democrats.
Over a third of
Well
Democrats.
Over a third. The actual rate is 6%. And that's another hilarious one because if you just look at the demographics for how many LGBTQ people do we have in America, period, like it's never been north of 10%, I don't think, ever. And so if you go look at the absolute number of Democrats it would require to make the statement true, every single one of them, number one, would have to be a Democrat. And number two, there'd have to actually be more LGBTQ people than actually there are. But the funnier one, I think this is pretty good too, asking Democrats to estimate rates of Republicans. Okay. They were asked what percentage are 65 or older, what percentage are evangelicals, what percentage are Southerners, what percentage earn $250,000 or more a year. Now, I don't know how this magic worked out, but across the board for every single one of those categories, Democrats guessed that 44% for all of those.
Isn't that interesting?
That's pretty odd. Okay. So for instance, the evangelicals, let's say, they guessed 44%, but only 34%. Right. Only a third are Republican. A third of Republicans are evangelical. Right. The funny one here to me is that last one. How many of those folks earn $250,000 a year or more? Democrats had 44%. Nearly half of the Republican Party earns $250,000 or more a year. The actual rate is 2%. That is another one where like there's not enough people in that
category alone,
that bracket,
right? Yeah.
to make that number true.
The interesting thing about that too is an interesting shift that's been happening or between the parties is, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, it was really a common stereotype where the Republicans are the party of the business class, they're the wealthy people and all of that, and Democrats are for the little guy, the unions and that kind of thing. Well, what we've seen over the last couple of decades is that the Democrats tend to be more wealthier on average than Republicans. And a lot of this is as people going through higher education have skewed Democrat. Mm-hmm. And there's still a wage premium for a 4-year degree. Yeah. That has really bumped up. So that's really, really funny given the dynamics of wealth between the two parties at this point.
I mean, it tells you like how sticky stereotypes can be though, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Another interesting bit about misperception. I just ran into this morning. It was a podcast I was listening to. It was an interview with a psychologist at Stanford named Rob Willer. I decided to go look up the actual paper he co-authored so I could get some more specific numbers than what he gave on the interview. The paper is called Correcting Inaccurate Meta-Perceptions Reduces American Support for Partisan Violence. So the study found that both Democrats and Republicans overestimate each other's willingness to engage in political violence by like a lot. So each thinks the other party is really willing to stage a coup or something like that, right? And it wasn't just that like, okay, they overestimated, but they like sky high overestimated. Some of the participants overestimated by anywhere from 245 to 442%.
Wow.
Yeah. So I will say the hopeful news that they found in the study was that the participants, when they were shown the actual percentages, like how far off they were about their rival party members, when they did this, the participants' own reported support for political violence went down. So in other words, like them thinking the other party was so violent was like increasing their own support for political violence. But it does suggest that some of the raw animus just stems from badly misjudging.
Misunderstanding one another.
Misperception.
Their motives. Right? That's exactly right.
Well, okay. That's a good segue for us to talk about affective polarization, which you bring up in the article. What is affective polarization?
It's a fancy term used by us political scientists to basically denote the kind of attitudes that we have towards each other, right? Kind of along the lines of affection. What's your level of affection for someone, if you will? It's the level of animosity, distrust, dislike between members of different political affiliations, at least in this context. It's, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not necessarily just or even primarily focused on disagreements about policies, although exaggerated characterizations about each other's policy preferences certainly play a part, right, as we've been discussing. But it's more about how we view each other. Are we citizens who have common values and seek common goals, but we have disagreements on how to accomplish those? Or are we combatants on the political battlefield who are in a fight to the death and battling people who want to literally harm us, right? That's kind of the difference that we're talking about here. And affective polarization is about the attitude that we come to the table with when we're dealing with others who do not have the same political leanings as ourselves. And unfortunately, that has been growing. That animosity, that distrust, that misunderstanding have all been growing over the past couple of decades. And in other words, we view our opponents, our political opponents, as threats to ourselves, our communities, and our civilization.
Okay. So you cited one study about affective polarization. It reminded me of Liliana Mason's work. She's a political scientist at Johns Hopkins. She's written a ton on this. If anybody just wants to like Google it, this is like her bread and butter, what she's written about. But if anybody wants specifics, she's got a paper called Ideologues Without Issues, The Polarizing Consequences of Ideological Identities. She also has a popular audience book that I've heard her interview for. It's very appealing. It's called Uncivil Agreement. She asked people, so in a lot of her work, what she does, she asks people how strongly they identified as liberal or conservative. Mm-hmm. She asked them their position on policy issues, stuff like immigration, Affordable Care Act, abortion, same-sex marriage, gun control. Okay, she asked them to think of someone of the opposite ideological persuasion. So if you're a conservative, think of a liberal or vice versa. And she asked them, how willing would you be to spend time with that person or be friends with that person or live next to them or marry that person? And she found that what predicted whether people were less willing to do any of these things had nothing to do with the issue, nothing to do with the policy issues whatsoever. It was just how strongly they identified ideologically as conservative or liberal. So if anything, I think that makes it clearer affective polarization has no necessary correlation with any disagreements about policy issues, right? Well, because of her work, I got really curious to go look up some more of this.
You do that on occasion.
I told you it was like a Wikipedia rabbit trail, your article and all the stuff that was on there. So here's some things I found. In 1960, 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats reported feeling displeased at the thought of their child marrying outside their political party. So like almost no one, right, cared if their kid married somebody of the opposite political party, right? By 2010, it was 49% of Republicans and 33% of Democrats. That is a massive bump, right? By 2016, it was 63% of Republicans and 60% of Democrats. Are you familiar with Cass Sunstein?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay. He and Richard Thaler wrote the Nudge book, right? Yeah. Okay. He points out that this is the exact opposite trend of public opinion toward interracial marriage. He cites info that as recently as 1986. I won't lie, when I read that, I was kind of depressed. That number was not older. That feels way too recent.
It does, doesn't it?
It feels way too recent. Okay, as recently as 1986, where some of us in this room were alive, yes, right? Yeah. 65% of people said they did not want their children marrying someone of another race. Wow. Now that number is less than 15%. Sunstein even introduced the term partyism. So like to describe that level of prejudice and hatred toward members of the opposing parties. I mean, based on what he's saying, it's like, at least in this very limited sense, partyism is the new racism. Like that means there's a considerable number of people out there who find it acceptable to view someone because of their party affiliation the way that they would now find it like unacceptable to view somebody because of their race. Right. Doesn't sit well with me.
There's problems with that.
Well,
right?
we've got the problem on the table. Let's talk about why this is happening. What are the root causes? Can you talk about the role media consumption plays in the perception gap and hatred for the other party?
Yeah, and I thought this was really, really interesting because as political scientists especially, there are certain things that we commonly tell people, hey, if you don't want to be a bad citizen, if you don't want to not understand what's going on, you need to do certain things. And one of those things is you should be informed about what's going on, right? So you would think being more informed by the news would actually help, but turns out not so much, right? The perception gap is higher in people who say they consume a lot of news media. People who followed the news most of the time had a perception gap 3 times higher than those who rarely followed the news. That seems weird, don't you think? Yeah. It seems like more information would be better. But, of course, the perception gap study also found that the type of news source one frequented made a difference. And while virtually all media sources tested in the study resulted in a perception gap, there were certainly some that were worse than others. However, none were found to be particularly helpful in helping people better understand the other side, except one. You want to guess Which one that was that?
If we're talking about the chart, well, go ahead and say it. The chart they had on this was really fascinating.
It was the traditional network news, right? So if you were to watch the network news, it actually helped negate that perception gap.
And in fact, don't they list it as that you even start to have a negative perception gap?
That's right.
Like not negative as in bad, but negative as in like you start to underestimate.
Correct. Right. Whereas for all other media sources, they all were worse than if you didn't pay attention to any news.
Isn't that interesting? They did talk about that the folks who said they basically just didn't even pay attention to it. Those people had the least perception gap.
Correct.
Of anyone.
So it really makes you want to know more about what's going on there. Now, as I write in the piece, our media sources have certainly segregated along very partisan lines also. Yeah. And so we create these, what we call information silos, where I'm only getting information that makes me feel really good about my affiliations, or gins me up to be really hostile towards the other side, right? And so I am absolutely sure that plays a part in this. And as we'll get into a little bit later, social media has only kind of exacerbated the problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, it has to be something like a lot of these outlets are doing, whether they mean to or not, they're doing like more identity affirming work than actual informing work, right? Something like that.
Right. And we've seen this where various outlets will publish something or broadcast something, and they will get in hot water with their primary base because it wasn't what that base wanted to hear. We've seen that with the New York Times. We saw that with Fox News when they were the first to announce that Joe Biden had won, I think it was the state of Arizona, which put him over the 270 electoral votes needed to win the presidency. And the backlash against Fox for announcing that was significant, to say the least. Some people lost their jobs over that at Fox News.
Really?
Oh, yes. And you saw some very rapidly growth in some of these really, really minor far-right kind of cable news. I use news in the square quotes in this discussion. News sites where people were just leaving Fox to go where they would get more of what they wanted.
Wow. Okay, I think my favorite of the causes you mentioned is the stuff about social sorting. I just find that fascinating and terrifying at the same time. Let's set this up. Here's a quote from your article. You write, "Research has shown that Republicans and Democrats are increasingly separating from one another geographically, religiously, and economically." And I definitely want to dive into each of those. But if you let me, though, I was just fascinated by the piece that you linked to about the geographically point.
That was just stark, right? It just kind of hits you right in the face.
Yeah, that was hard to just wrap my mind around. What you're citing is an article called "A Close-Up Picture of Partisan Segregation." It's a 2021 New York Times piece by the authors Badger, Quealy, and Katz. Mm-hmm. Let me read a quote from it. Quote, "The broad outlines of America's partisan divides are visible on any map. Republicans typically dominate in most southern and plain states, and Democrats in northeastern and west coast ones." And when I read that, that's like common knowledge. Like that's been true for a while. But this is where it gets interesting. But keep zooming in, say, to the level of individual addresses for 180 million registered voters, and this pattern keeps repeating itself. Democrats and Republicans live apart from each other down to the neighborhood to a degree that raises provocative questions about how closely lifestyle preferences have become aligned with politics. So they're reporting on a study done by a team of researchers at Harvard who tried to find out just how much geographical sorting happens down to the level of the individual. I looked up the original paper, but it really is worth checking out the newspaper article itself because they have these stunning visual maps created on the basis of this research. The maps include there were a lot of cities that they put up on there, but for major metro areas from both red and blue states. They had Atlanta, Indianapolis, Boston, Charlotte, North Carolina. They talk in the article about, they mention Oklahoma City, but I even went to the original paper to see. I couldn't find the actual map. That would have been really interesting.
That would have been.
But the sample maps, you can go and look, and it's like the shape of a neighborhood block with the streets around it. You can just see there's no purple. It is, that
right.
block is
you've
blue.
You've got red here and you've got blue here, and there's no, it's like, there's some barrier keeping each side to its side.
You would
right?
You would think just on, who is like telling their realtor, we're going to need a Democrat neighborhood here. I'm sorry. You're going to have to figure that out. Yes, we want the 4 bedrooms. We want the garage, but we're going to have, this is somehow happening.
I don't think people are deliberately choosing, I want to live in a Republican neighborhood or a Democrat neighborhood, but something is certainly going on that is driving them into neighborhoods of like-minded individuals. Right?
That is, this is not just like the coastal elites versus the Midwest Plains anymore. This is down to a neighborhood in a city. Oh, okay. That's geographic sorting. Let's talk about, you say Republicans or Democrats are sorting religiously too. You cite an article here about people going church shopping based on their politics. What's that about?
Well, okay. So, there are so many religious options in the United States. And I'm going to stick to the one that I am most familiar with, Christianity, but other options than that, right? And we can almost, because of there's so many options, we can almost think of religious adherents as religion consumers. Now, I know some of my fellow believers are going to, that's blasphemous. We're not consumers, right? But just stick with me for a second here. It's long been known that some denominations tend to be more aligned with the political left, while some were better aligned with the right. However, we're now entering this period where people are prioritizing their political beliefs in the search for a religious home, right? Does the pastor rail against abortion and non-traditional relationships, or do they rail against poverty and racial injustice, right? We're increasingly deciding on where to attend church through our political lens, right? Not our faith lens, not our religious lens, but our political lens. And it's why, quite frankly, that term evangelical, which is so prominent in political discussions now, has pretty much lost all of its religious meaning as a way of describing a certain set of Christian believers. And it's now pretty much become exclusively a political label.
Wow. I'm guessing, I can't remember if the article included or not. I'm guessing what you're finding then, such church shoppers are probably leaving churches that say refuse to get political in their messaging.
There was a few news stories a few months back about how pastors in evangelical churches were teaching in their sermons or whatnot on the Beatitudes, the famous sermon of Jesus on the Beatitudes. And they were getting pushback from some of their congregants about, why are you teaching all that liberal stuff? And listen, I don't want to pretend like there isn't a similar kind of dynamic on the religious left, right? There are certainly positions that those on the religious left, if they were to take or to discuss, would get pushback as well.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
But it's that very much we are seeing our religious teachings through this now ever-present political lens, right, that shapes everything that we do and think and say.
Okay. So you're also saying we are sorting, Republicans and Democrats are sorting economically. Can you talk about the savings.com study?
Yeah. So savings.com did this study in 2022 where 83% of sampled consumers said they had deliberately stopped shopping at a certain places because of a company's labor practices, religious or political affiliations, environmental policies, or even just for failing to take a political stance on an issue. So you can't even avoid this by not entering the fray, right? If you don't say something, well, then you're obviously against me.
Wow. So like, I just hate that store because they're just not political enough.
Right, right. And it goes on to say that people are increasingly using their purchases. Again, we're making our religious decisions based on politics. They're increasingly making our purchases as a means of making a political statement. So what I buy and where I buy it is now a reflection of my politics. And look, we know these examples of this, right? Progressive boycotts of Chick-fil-A over its CEO's comments about same-sex marriage, or a conservative boycott of Bud Light for using a member of the trans community in one of their ads. So this goes on and on and on, right? And so again, for whatever reason and however this happened, politics has become all-consuming. We're not able to say, okay, here's what I think about politics and whether the government should have higher taxes or lower taxes, or whether we should have more immigration or less immigration, and that's all right there. But when I'm in church, it's about this, or when I'm in my social group, it's about that, or whatever. It's all about politics now.
So yeah, what you cited, that was a case of, people quite deliberately engaging in shopping choices based on politics. You and I have chatted before and about the thing. This is what I find more shocking, is that this sorting happens even on accident, like the economic sorting.
That's right.
Where like no one meant to choose where they shop based on politics. There's a 2014 article in Time magazine. It's called "How Liberal Is Your Burger?" Which
That's a great title.
It's a great title.
Yeah.
I mean, I just smile every time I hear that. The author is Chris Wilson. And Wilson reports what percentage of various companies' regular customers belong to one party or the other. Okay. I'll just give a couple. He gives quite a bit. If you shop at Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, there's over a 2/3 chance you're a Democrat. But if you shop at Kroger's or IGA, there's nearly an 80% chance you're a Republican. That number just seems sky high to me. Like that's just, wow. Okay. American Apparel, the clothing store, right? They run majority Democrat, whereas Buckle runs majority Republican. I might be mistaken, but I believe some of those are in the same malls, right? And White Castle, the burgers, the fast food joint, White Castle runs majority Democrat, whereas Sonic runs majority Republican. What does my burger have to do with my politics? I mean, that starts to get crazy. And I thought about, somebody might say like, yeah, but we're really just still talking about geographic sorting here. Maybe we're talking about there's just more White Castles in blue states and there's just more Sonics in red states. But the article we just talked about, the one about geographic sorting, about major metropolitan areas, right, that has to mean that, no, like the state you're in is not the whole story on that. That just can't be right. Some people living in the same metro areas who have the same economic choices still end up sorting based on politics. It's weird to me that I could walk in to a coffee shop and just based on the particular coffee shop I'm in, I could probably gamble that people are Democrat or Republican and like have a pretty good chance of knowing. Winning.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That's wild. I think the scary point, this means that people of different parties are like just not interacting on the most day-to-day mundane activities that they engage in. They are just not interacting with each other.
They have no real communication or interaction with one another.
Shared experiences even.
I was thinking, I'm going to go back to that geographic sorting for a minute. So what if some of that is, okay, if I am a Democrat and we know if I'm a Democrat, I'm going to tend to be more liberal. I'm going to probably tend to have fewer children than if I'm a Republican household, right? So I'm wondering if you were to if we could compare the types of houses in those neighborhoods, would you find Republicans choosing maybe larger houses or houses with more bedrooms, less office space or something like that, and Democrats choosing the other? And that is helping. I don't think it would explain all of that, but helping to drive some of that division that we see. I just, as I was looking at that, I was like, well, what is it about Republicans and Democrats that even though they're not consciously saying, I want to live with a bunch of other Democrats, they're driving to do that. And so things that deal with family formation and the type of house that one or the other might want might be one of those factors.
If I need a larger house, that already puts me more likely in the suburbs than an urban core, let's say, right? Yeah. Right.
Now, if you're looking at some of these others like Kroger's or, Trader Joe's, I'm not sure what's going on there. Maybe the availability of it. Maybe that is we mentioned earlier, if Democrats are skewing more wealthy, does Whole Foods and Trader Joe's
is cheap. They have made their brand on being very cheap.
I have not shopped there, so I will have to check that out. I'll take your word for it though. But you see what I'm saying. There might be something else driving that it just impacts more of one or the other as well. But it's the fact we're not interacting with one another a whole lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to me, it's that like, if you were to sit down with each other, I mean, you can't even say like, gosh, I could go for me a White Castle right now. And like the other person just is going to look at you like you're from another planet. What are you talking about, White Castle? I don't eat there. I eat Sonic, And you would think something like a burger is exactly what any group of Americans could bond over, right? I mean, and it turns out, no. Okay, let's switch. Let's talk about education in all this, because the Perception Gap website had some interesting stuff about the role of having a formal education in all this.
Yes.
And it had to do with the diversity of your social circles, right?
Right. Okay. And so this was probably the most interesting one of these that they talk about to me, which was, according to the study, quote, the more educated a person is, the worse their perception gap, with one critical exception. This trend only holds true for Democrats, not Republicans. In other words, while Republicans' misperceptions of Democrats do not improve with levels of higher education, Democrats' understanding of Republicans actually gets worse with every additional degree they earn. This effect is so strong that Democrats without a high school diploma are 3 times more accurate than those with a postgraduate degree, unquote. So
wow.
That's fascinating to me. Okay. So then that of course prompts you to say, well, what in the heck is going on there? They speculate. Now they don't provide, they didn't say that they had hard evidence, but one of the things that they speculate is that Democrats in higher education have way fewer interactions with people of the opposite party or differing beliefs than Republicans do.
Yeah.
And so they thought was what was driving that. But again, the jury's still out on whether or not that's the case. But we do know, I mean, we've had study after study showing, again, over the last 2 or 3 decades, higher education itself has skewed leftward in its political ideology among faculty and among administrators. And so that should concern those in higher ed about creating this kind of monoculture where we only see things from one perspective. Because that then begins to undercut your ability to identify the weaknesses of your thinking. And for institutions that are supposed to be about knowledge creation, getting to the truth, if you're slicing off a good bit of knowledge or understanding, or even an ability to critique your particular perspective, you're not going to get there.
Yeah.
Right.
No, that's right. The absolute numbers that they shared, though, I thought were just also interesting. So you said like there's a trend among Democrats that does not exist among Republicans when it comes to the education effect, we could call it, I guess. But just the absolute numbers, we're still saying. So what they're reporting on is Republicans and Democrats who said almost all their friends hold the same political views. And what they've got is a trend of like 30% of Republicans across the educational divide just don't have Democratic friends. They just don't. And now among Democrats, on that less educated side, you do get like just north of 20% say, I just don't have any Republican friends. But once you go get your PhD, that looks north of 40% to me.
That's right.
You just don't have you just have no Republicans in your life somehow. That's wild. Okay. You talk about social media definitely contributes to the problem, right? So how does it do that?
So most researchers have found that the key to getting people engaged on social media is through pulling at their emotions, right? And few emotions are more powerful than outrage. I'm going to get you mad about something.
I believe we have talked about moral outrage porn before.
We have done so. Yes, we have, right? And I will admit, I have to be careful of that when I'm on certain social media sites because it's really easy to fall into that trap.
It's almost like it's designed to be very effective.
That's right. That's right. So the more that you can get people mad at something, the more likely they are to engage on social media, right? By posting, commenting, sharing, all of that stuff. And social media algorithms are designed to feed people what will get them to engage, right? So we figured out you're going to get more response. You're going to click more, share more, whatever, if I get you mad about something. So understanding that that's what I'm in the business of doing as a social media company, what am I going to do? I'm going to feed you a whole bunch of moral outrage porn, right? And get you highly engaged, right? So, and this is backed up by people's personal experiences. A study by Agility PR and KRC Research said that a large majority of Americans believe that social media has directly contributed to a decline of civility, right? And that belief holds across all sorts of various demographic categories, right? Age, gender, sex, race, education levels. It holds that the majority of folks see this on a regular basis, that yes, social media has made us less civil towards one another.
Good time, social media. I want to at least try to imagine an interlocutor saying like, well, okay, so what? If we're just talking about online stuff, maybe ultimately this stuff really isn't as bad as we're making out to be. Maybe this is just Twitter play and it doesn't really affect anything. I want to try to make a last ditch effort to convince that there is a deeply interpersonal problem that this is introducing. There is a philosophy professor at William & Mary University, Chris Fryman, who I believe we're trying to...
He's going to be on an upcoming episode. That's right.
Nice. Okay. He assembled a bunch of survey data about this. I want to rattle off. He's got a lot of good ones here. 13% of Americans reported blocking friends on their social media accounts because of political disagreements. 16% stop talking to a friend or family member over politics. Not just stop talking about politics, stop talking to them over politics. 13% ended a relationship with a friend or family member. 27% limited their interactions with certain friends or family members as a result of politics. Nearly 40% of Democrats and Republicans believe that members of the other party are not just worse for politics, they're downright evil. 20% of Democrats and 15% of Republicans agreed that we'd be better off as a country if large numbers of the opposing party just died. Just died. Employers, this is getting sadder and sadder. Employers are less likely to pursue job applicants whose resumes signal a partisan affiliation contrary to their own. So if you're out there on the job market, you might want to hold your views close to your chest.
Keep your views to yourself, so to speak. Yeah.
We're educators. This one really upset me. People are less likely to award a scholarship to an out-party member.
Right.
And over half of partisans rated members of the opposing party as less evolved than members of their own party. They located out-party members farther away from an image of a modern human on a scale showing the stages of human evolution. Those conservatives,
they're knuckle dragging.
Those last couple, especially that last one, seem particularly bad. But it's not just, you're arguing it's not just about broken relationships and maybe even lost personal opportunities. You think this is just bad for democracy, period.
Yeah.
How so?
That's right. So this disdain and mistrust and misunderstanding and now separation that we have for those who disagree with us politically extends beyond now these traditional political boundaries as we've been discussing. And my fear is that it is eroding the social trust and social capital that democratic governance relies upon, right? So democracy is more than just a few simple institutions arranged in a particular way. It's a set of values and norms that engenders trust and cooperation among citizens. And we used to talk about the importance of civil society to democracy. Civil society can be understood as those non-governmental and non-market institutions in which people of all sorts of backgrounds, racial, religious, educational differences, engage with one another and work to better their communities. You can think of these with such organizations as Rotary Clubs, Chambers of Commerce, Lions Clubs, Big Brothers, Big Sister, Junior Achievement, all of those kinds of organizations. And these organizations foster the social cooperation and build the social capital among their participants outside of the coercive nature of government, right? Yeah. So government is about coercion, and we don't want you to do something, and we are going to make you pay if you do it, right? So outside that coercive nature of governments, but also outside the purely transactional environment of markets, right? I'm not doing this because I'm going to get some sort of financial benefit, right? I'm not doing this because I'm giving you something and I know you're going to give me something in return. Without that social cooperation, democracy just deteriorates into another means by which we try to dominate those that we don't like. Rather, it becomes a tool for dominance rather than a means for peaceful coexistence and accepted decision-making. And this growing incivility can actually become a threat to the civil liberties and civil rights that we say we hold so dearly.
Well, I mean, okay, so obviously I'm gathering pro-civility.
I am. Yes.
I'm a little, we did just have a guest about this entire topic. That was a great interview. Mm-hmm. I'm still nervous. We might have listeners who hear civility and they say like, oh, okay, so he's saying just be nice or whatever. Right. No, it's more specific than that, right? You talk about the heterodox way and the recommendations from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Will you talk about those specifics?
Sure, I'd love to. So the Heterodox Academy, of which I am a member, is an organization that's dedicated to fostering viewpoint diversity, open inquiry, and constructive disagreement within higher education. And the organization has thousands of members across the world who have agreed to conduct their professional and intellectual disagreements in a specific way. It's a way we call the heterodox way. And so it includes things like making your case with evidence. In other words, citing or describing the source of information that you're using to form your opinion, right? Being intellectually charitable.
Wait, let's just make very clear. That means I can't just read the headline of an article?
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
I've been doing that all wrong.
Look at what that article might link to and whether or not the sources are decent and the information is actually there. Being intellectually charitable, right? Assume, I know this is going to be hard for some of us, and I'm including myself in that state, assume that reasonable, informed, and intelligent people may actually disagree with you. Hey, not everybody's going to agree, even if we're all smart, intelligent people. Be intellectually humble, right? Be open to changing your mind should the facts warrant it. Be constructive, focus on gaining a deeper understanding of our world, not just on winning an argument. I think that's in social media, it's all about winning arguments, right? I rarely can see a constructive conversation, at least on Twitter for sure. Not too many that I've seen on Facebook, although I think I've had a couple on Facebook. But you can kind of have a longer back and forth. Than
almost
Twitter,
as though intellectual curiosity is a virtue.
Right? You would think, right? And be yourself, right? This is the fifth one of those things. Use your social capital to push back against adverse trends and lead by example, right? So that's the heterodox way. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace offers these suggestions. Call out your own party. So in other words, stand up to those on your side when they use polarizing or hateful language, right? Don't tolerate that within your own midst, if you will. Downplay the fringes and highlight the median. Remember, as we've been discussing, there tends to be a pretty broad agreement on a lot of issues. But what gets the focus, unfortunately, are the divisions. And we sometimes make, the old saying, making mountains out of molehills, right? And so focus on what makes us similar and the commonalities that we have, not just the divisions. Emphasize your disagreement within parties. One thing that people don't tend to understand is both major parties are amalgams of a whole bunch of other interests. And those interests have to work with each other to be successful in their party endeavors. And there's tension amongst them. They're not all just lockstep. Not every Republican agrees on every single issue. Not every Democrat agrees on every single issue. There's a variety of positions that can be taken across those labels. And recognize that, that's probably a good thing, right? It's probably good that there are even differences of opinions within parties. And then they suggest avoid misrepeating information. What I found interesting was even when you're trying to debunk misinformation, stick to the truth, don't repeat the misinformation and then try to debunk it, right?
Yeah.
Because the misinformation is more likely to just stick.
I've heard this, like when people have the approach, they want to put up like on a slide or something and say like myth, and then they say the myth. There's lab evidence that actually reinforces belief in the myth itself, that's not how to do it. Yeah.
Now, one of the interesting things I really want to mention briefly is a trend that's developing in academic research called adversarial collaboration. And so this is where you have researchers who have opposing views on phenomena that they're investigating, what causes this, and maybe you have two different sides about what they think is the cause of that, where they actually agree to work together and design a research study that can be used to help resolve their differences, right? And so the process will help control for individual researchers' biases and their preferences, and then thereby help improve the reliability of the findings. So I'm hoping that is a trend that will continue and bleeds over into other areas.
I just have one last curious question, and this wasn't in your article. It just got me thinking. There's been, like a decades long trend now toward just almost squarely focusing on national level politics, despite the fact that like everybody's got local politics issues of interest to themselves, right? I mean, we all know when we're going to be very angry if they put a stoplight at a particular street or something like that, right? I just wonder, like, what if I'm an outlier and I tend to obsess over local rather than national? Do you think I would still, I don't know, like, would I have the luxury of being like having that much animus toward an out party member?
Well, you're hitting on the mark here, and I could probably do a whole episode just on federalism and how kind of this trend of abandoning that for more nationalization of issues. I will try to be brief. I'm sure Santiago will appreciate that. But probably a lot of people will point back to the 1930s as kind of this where this trend started. You could probably go back even a couple of decades earlier, but you begin to see this trend to be looking at the national government as the entity to solve problems, right? Whether those are economic problems or racial divisions or something else, we begin to look at it as the problem of doing that. Whereas the state governments were kind of seen as side actors in this. And the problem this creates is that the stakes over every policy issue become that much greater as a result of this, right? If state governments or even local governments are viewed as the primary mechanisms in which to address most issues, then what the governments of California or New York or Florida or any other state does is not a whole lot of concern to me because I'm a resident of Oklahoma, right? And they can do their thing and we'll do our thing here, right? On the other hand, if we decide we're going to have the national government make these decisions, then I have a strong interest in trying to force my version of what's right, whether that's on taxes, gun control, abortion, business regulation, whatever, on the entire nation, right? I'm going to try to make sure what I want is imposed on everybody else. Now the stakes get extremely high, extremely quickly.
Yeah.
And we become more distrustful, more hostile, less understanding those we see as our political opponents. The fight to gain control of those decision-making institutions has become more vicious. How many elections have we had now? How many presidential elections, especially, where the case was made, this is the most important election in our lifetime?
I've never heard anybody say that before.
And that's a direct result of the stakes being so high because we want one government. We've got thousands of government. If you include local governments, we got thousands of governments in this country, and we've decided that only one of them should be the one making most of the decisions, or at least the important decisions, right? I do want to mention real quickly a trade-off that has to be acknowledged, and that is that state governments historically have been the source of many, if not most, of the violations of civil liberties and civil rights of our citizens. And so we have to be cognizant of that. And the purpose of a national constitution is to guarantee some basic rights for all of our people. So there's going to be some tension about what those basic rights are and which governments are best suited to protect them. But a question also needs to be asked about regarding whether or not allowing one level of government or another to make these decisions is going to foster greater peace and tolerance, or foster greater conflict and polarization?
Well, it's all fascinating. We absolutely did not cover all of the stuff you linked to. There was a lot of stuff we left out that was really great. And it's if it's just the article itself, it's a pretty fast and easy read. Very recommended. If you want to go check that out at NonDoc, search for "We Hate Each Other. Growing Incivility Undermines the Values of Our Democracy." And thank you, James, for letting us talk about all this.
Not
today.
a problem. I'm glad to do it.
All right. We will catch you next time. Thanks for listening to Curiosity Porn with the two best intellectual pole dancers in the United States, Dr. Guy Crane and Professor James Davenport. If you'd like to share a comment about today's episode, suggest a guest or topic, or just leave a compliment or complaint, you can reach us at curprn@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you.